What's going on? It's LPTV and it don't stop, man. What you're about to hear is the truth, some more truth, and this is about a Christian white supremacist who was born into a hate group, who gets out of it and tells her story. And this is not for children, okay? So if you're under 18, I suggest you do not listen to this, okay? You're going to hear some shocking things that, hey, I didn't even know that it was like this. I did not even know. You know, I was naive to a lot of stuff. But today you're going to hear the truth about a white supremacy and how she was born into a hate group and how she gets out, and she tells it all. Survivor tells it all.
Dive into all of the many questions that I'm getting around white supremacy, what that looked like from the inside out, my rationalization and justification for it. And I do want to give a little warning at the beginning of this video that I think that some of the things I'm going to talk about are going to be really hard to hear. And I want you to know that they are just as hard for me to talk about as they will be for you to listen to. So let's just dive right in. I'm Jenny Gage, and this is Life Take 2.
What we've done here is establish a place where we have control over who our neighbors are, and that is just for the sake of preserving, our culture.
And that culture, effectively, we're saying this is a white culture, a whites-only place.
White American culture.
Over the last year and a half, high up in the Ozark Hills in the state of Arkansas, dozens of people have been working hard, leveling the land, building houses. They call it an intentional community based around shared ancestry, a long-winded way of saying something really quite simple.
I think we would generally be called far right, sure.
It's called Return to the Land, and they invited me in. A seemingly bucolic and sometimes surreal experience. But this is built on a radical modern premise, made possible because of a new political and technological moment, one with strong ties to the most active far-right groups in the US. Instead of taking to the streets, they are building their own, for generations to come.
It's important for me to do this for my ancestors, my friends, my family, my children, my children's children.
Its founder says he is building a fortress for the white race.
It's a racial association. I kind of want to ask you, after seeing this, do you think what we're doing is immoral?
I have a ton of people sending me this video this week and asking me what I think about it. And I love that this video exists because I want you to imagine now 200 years down the line that this all-white community has, built in isolation there in the middle of the Ozarks or the Appalachians, wherever they are in Arkansas. And now their descendants 200 years from now, what are they going to look like? That's me. The Mormons did that 200 years ago. They left civilization. They took their little white European, Scandinavian, British, English, German selves out to Salt Lake City, and they taught their whites only stuff for 200 years. And I am the result of that. My kids are 7th generation, I was 5th generation, and we are the result of the OG white supremacist cult in America, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And people have asked, would you have moved to a community like that 7 years ago? I did. That was my life. I picked the whitest country club neighborhood, and that's where I lived. All of my friends were white. All of my friends were Mormon. And then when I left the Mormon church, all of my friends were still white, and they were all Christian. I just started talking about white supremacy on my YouTube channel here a couple of weeks ago, and I think that most people are picturing those neo-Nazi groups. They're picturing the skinheads, they're picturing the Klan, they're picturing all of that stuff. But what they don't realize is that there are white supremacists here in America today, and a lot of them, so many of them, that are packaged in Jesus and packaged in church, and they wear little crosses and they look really sweet, and they're absolutely not. I want to share with you what that white supremacy felt like from the inside out. Now, a lot of my videos are carefully scripted. I have tons of scriptures and cross references and all kinds of other videos and stuff. I have 15 minutes before I have to go get in the shower and get ready for work. I'm in my pajamas and I have makeup or eating breakfast, so I don't have time to script today. We're just going to plow through this, and I think that it's more important to share what I learned and what my personal experience is than to cross-reference all of the scriptures and the doctrines and everything that everybody said. So first of all, that viewpoint of born and raised multi-generational, I was the product of a community that this was their ideology since the beginning, and I was the child of multi-generational family. So every one of my aunts and uncles and my cousins and my mom and my grandparents and everybody, this was their absolute reality too. Okay, so here's what I believed about race. You have to go way back to the past life, which Mormons call the pre-existence. If you just Google Mormon pre-existence, then you can read all about that. I believed that I was literally birthed by one of the heavenly mothers and Heavenly Father, Elohim God, and that we lived in a life before we gained earth bodies where we could make choices and we had our personalities and our passions. Like the person that I am today, that's who I was in this past life. And all of God's spirit children were being born into this past life until he had amassed, billions and billions of people. And at that point, God, who was white, the heavenly mothers who were white, they called together all of his spirit children in what's called the council in heaven. And in this council in heaven, God told us that he wanted us to become a God like himself. And in order to do so, we'd have to come to earth, gain physical bodies, and if we passed the test, then we could come back to him and be gods and goddesses just like him and his heavenly wives. So God presents this plan for us to become like him, and his two sons volunteered to play a really pivotal role of savior. God wanted us to have free choice, and to do so, he'd have to have a sacrifice in the form of one of his children giving up their lives, and also being that exemplar for everybody. So Jesus came forward, and Lucifer, who would later become Satan, and they had opposing views. All of us spirit children chose sides. 2/3 of us went with Jesus, and 1/3 of God's children went with Satan. Well, they lost the war, so they were cast out. They never see bodies. They can never become gods, and they are now these satanic forces that rule over the world, led by Satan. But of those 2/3, there were part of them that were kind of apathetic, kind of fence sitters was a word that one of the Mormon prophets used to describe them. And another phrase that the Mormon prophets used to describe these people who, they got to stay in heaven, they got to come down to earth, and they hadn't quite followed Satan, but they weren't the best spirit children of God. The phrase that the Mormon prophets used for them is less valiant. They were less valiant in a past life. And so what happened to those people, according to what my church taught me, was they were cursed to be born to African families. And here's why being born to African families was such a curse. Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve, Cain kills Abel. Cain is cursed with black skin. He's then removed from the Garden of Eden, which was in America, in Jackson County, Missouri. Adam on Diamond is the biblical Adamic language word that I was taught as a child. And so Cain was cast down to Africa, given black skin. All of his descendants were those less valiant spirits, so not only were they physically cursed, but they just weren't the best spirits to begin with. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, this is crazy, it absolutely is. And I don't know how very many adults who hear this convert to the Mormon church. I think it's really a tricky thing to sell these days. But again, that childhood indoctrination, I was born and raised into a community that taught this. And I've said in other videos that just as I was learning how to walk and talk and zip up my own coat in the kindergarten coat closet, I was being taught, you lived in heaven, Heavenly Father, the war in heaven, they're cursed, they're sent down, black people, they come from Africa, they were bad spirits, and then Cain was bad here on earth. So those are not good people, nor are the indigenous people of the United States, because the Book of Mormon, there was a good brother, there were two bad brothers, the bad brothers were cursed with brown skin. That's why the Indians have brown skin, because these are cursed people. And it would have been as difficult for me to unlearn that concept as it would have been to forget how to zip my coat in the kindergarten closet. Every cell in my body had accepted it as truth because I was taught it in scriptures, and scriptures don't lie. That's the truth. That's the most true thing in the world. Our prophets are charismatic leaders with their big bright smiles, stood at the pulpits in our local congregations and sometimes took in the whole world talking about these truths. My parents, my family, my home reinforced it. The artwork, books that we had, music that was written just for children reinforced this. The whole community at large reinforced this truth. For me to think anything otherwise would have been like learning to walk sideways instead of forward. No, my knees bend, I'm supposed to go forward, I can't walk sideways. Black people are cursed. Native Americans are cursed. And this right here is why I think that it's more dangerous than joining like a neo-Nazi group. Because I never had critical thinking to begin with. I didn't come from just a normal life. My whole life was this. There are two other really important ideologies that are kind of foundational to my white supremacy. One of them was the battle of good and evil that was constantly going on. And that battle of good and evil made me look at people who were suffering as people who God was punishing. So let me give you an example of this. I know I shared in another video that I was born in 1974. So I grew up with the Ethiopian famines. And I remember seeing them on the news and going to my grandma and saying, can we send some money? Like somebody had said, you can send money or something to help with food, put a check in the mail, do this. And my grandma saying, oh no, God has cursed them. We can't interfere with that. I viewed everything as a battle of good and evil. If you were being punished, then God was doing that to you and it wasn't my place to interfere. And I would look around at all of the suffering in the world. So Africa and Mexico, some of the Middle Eastern countries and stuff that were less developed in the 70s and 80s. And to me, that was just further proof. Oh yeah, God is really giving those people their consequences for being evil people, for not being Mormon, for not being righteous, and for choosing evil and idolatrous ways. And then look at me and look at my community. We're so happy, we're so blessed, we have so much money. Never once did I think that's privilege or we have gotten here by stomping on everybody else. To me, my community was being blessed and their community was being cursed because they followed Satan and I followed Jesus. That battle of good and evil was almost like rooting for a sports team, and I had so much indifference to it. I'm rooting for Jesus, and Jesus is going to take really good care of me. They're all on Satan's side. Like, we already know who's going to win this Super Bowl. It's going to be Jesus. Another teaching that really shaped white supremacy and shaped me was that God reveals things to the righteous, that all light and truth comes from God, and that he will pour out his spirit, pour out revelations, pour out innovations and technology to those who are chosen. So I believed that the founding fathers had been inspired by Heavenly Father. I believed that Christopher Columbus had been led across the sea by Heavenly Father. Any discoveries were because those people were more righteous, because they were more chosen, and because God was revealing his eternal truths to them, whether it was the discovery of electricity or some vaccine. I believed that God revealed everything. It wasn't just man-made discovery. It was God revealing things. And here's how that shaped white supremacy for me. I did not believe that brown-skinned people who were cursed were capable of innovation, discovery, of doing anything great. This is really hard for me to say, but it's information that I think is really important for people to hear. That was just validated by watching the news and seeing that, like, white people like me, we were living in houses with electricity, and then over there in Ethiopia, it was a disaster. They didn't have any innovation. They had not had the technology that we had because they were cursed. And so God didn't reveal any of those truths to them. Funny story to go along with this very dark little topic here. I think I was in about middle school when we started learning about the Aztecs and the Mayans. And all of a sudden, I see these really advanced civilizations, and our teachers were showing pictures of people, in slideshows and textbooks and stuff that were brown skinned. And I really grappled with that. Like, that couldn't be the case. So I come to class one day and I raise my hand and I say, little known fact, but the Mayans and the Aztecs were actually white skinned. They weren't brown skinned, because in the Book of Mormon, everybody who came from Jerusalem was white until the good, righteous, holy brother and then the two bad brothers got in a rift, and God cursed these two with the skin of blackness. That's the exact phrasage from the Book of Mormon. This guy's white and delightsome. These guys are cursed with the skin of blackness, that they will be loathsome unto him and his people. And then towards the end of the Book of Mormon, there's this huge battle, and the descendants of the brown guys, they kill all the white guys. So I had been taught from birth that the peoples of the Americas had originally been white through disobedience to God's plan. They'd been cursed with brown skin. That's why, again, the Native Americans were brown skinned. So the only way that middle school me could reconcile these beautiful pyramids and the scientific discoveries and all the mathematics and everything of these ancient South American civilizations was to conclude that, oh, that must have been the Nephites. That was the white Indians that did all of that. The brown people were running around in the jungle eating raw meat. That's what my scriptures told me. The Book of Mormon taught me that the brown-skinned people ended up being cannibals, and then they were forcing cannibalism on other people. There's this whole section in there where they kidnap all the women and children. They do horrible things to them, and then they force them to eat their own husbands and fathers. That's what I believed of the Indians. And that was the only reality that I knew. I don't remember what my middle school teacher said, but he did not agree with me. And again, when you think of white supremacists, you picture the neo-Nazis, you picture skinheads, whatever. The checker at Trader Joe's would have never thought Jenny's a white supremacist, but I would have left Trader Joe's. I would have driven home to my $1 million mansion. Again, I didn't have any Black or Native American or Mexican friends because they're descended from Native Americans, but I did have housekeepers and landscapers and other servant type of staff that were brown skinned, and I was really nice to them. I was really kind to them, but I also felt like that's where they belonged. So when my crew of Mexican housekeepers was on their knees scrubbing my toilets in my $1 million house and my fancy gated community in Mesa, Arizona, with all the luxury vehicles parked in the garage, I very much felt like they were in their place. That was the place, not that I had put them in, but that's where God had put them. And that's where they would be until they accepted the Mormon gospel, came back to Jesus, and washed away their curse in the baptismal font. My church also taught me that once someone was baptized in the Mormon church, whether you're African or Mexican or Native American, that you would become white. And I think that if I was just doing like a 1-minute video on what white supremacy was from the inside out, it was that moment right there of I am the white person in the $1 million house with all the white kids and all the success and all this stuff, and you're scrubbing my toilets, and that's God's order. That is the working definition of white supremacy right there. I've had a few people ask me if I ever had any internal conflict over my white supremacist peers, and yes, there's a couple I want to share with you. So during the Ethiopian famines, Where the World came out, and I was at a slumber party or something, and so they had the record. And I remember looking at that record case with all of these people of different colors and nationalities, and then listening to this song, and the song connected me emotionally to the suffering of the people in Ethiopia like it was intended to do. And I'm such a music girl anyway, and it made me cry, and it totally inspired me. And so that became a conflict for me. On the one hand, my grandma, Africa's a hot mess, and we need to stay out of Africa. They're being cursed because they're bad people, they were bad spirits. But then on the other hand, this beautiful song that really spoke to my heart, I eventually saved up my babysitting money, bought myself a copy of the record that I kept in between my mattresses, because seriously, if my mom had found it, she probably would have chucked it in the garbage. That love and compassion and true connection for the Ethiopians through music did cause a lot of internal conflict, and I did have to incorporate a lot of mental gymnastics. Another moment of huge internal conflict for me was a church shooting that happened in South Carolina in like 2015, 2016, while we were living in South Carolina. And my initial instinct was to go to our friends and neighbors who were all members of the KKK. And I do want to be really clear, because I've talked about our friends who are KKK. My husband and I were invited to join, and I was never Klan. I was never, ever KKK. But I did definitely sympathize with them. Klan hated Mormons too. If they had been more Mormon friendly, I don't know, maybe we would have joined. But they also hated us, and they wanted us to convert to being Baptist. So when that event happened, I went immediately to the store that was owned by my Klan, some leadership of the Klan, and I bought all the Dixie flags that I could. I flew them in my planters. I flew one. I had bumper stickers. We had Dixie flags everywhere to show our support of our culture. And this was the window of time when I took this little selfie of myself with the Dixie flag, and it's right next to my little cross necklace there. And that's what was going on over the next couple of weeks, just watching the news stories, because I'm not a psychopath. I started to see the faces of people who had been killed and really dig into the story behind everything. And it was clear that I was on the absolute wrong side. So I took down all the Dixie flags and took off my pin and my earrings and whatever else I had that I was using to identify myself as part of the resistance. Another time that I had a lot of internal conflict over my white supremacy was as a 20-something-year-old reading the book Roots. I read it while we were in Arkansas with not only Mormon family that was already racist, but then our Southern Mormon family who was like old school white supremacist, totally racist, and connecting to the story of chattel slavery for the first time ever in my life caused so much internal conflict. And I remember reading that book and just thinking, how could God want this to happen to anybody just because Cain in the Garden of Eden did this and whatever? Like, how could a God want anyone to go through this? Roots caused a lot of internal conflict for me. Then I fell in love with Oprah, and she was like such a guide to me, and she helped me understand my life and the world in so many different ways. But Oprah, one day, just a few years into her show, had a gay couple on, and I would boycott Oprah for the next 5 years. I actually had a little watchdog group of moms where we boycotted certain movies and music groups and things like that. But I even made a little flyer on Canva. It was called Nopra. No Oprah, Nopra. And I had this feeling of, I trusted Oprah, but no, she was evil. So, man, that battle of good and evil. I know I've mentioned in other videos that I did vote for Barack Obama privately. Nobody ever knew that I had done that. And I was a huge Obama fan. I had to pretend like I wasn't on the outside. He was so inspiring. He had me from the Democratic National Convention. I was this alt-right, Mormon, Christian nationalist, white supremacist, and I voted for Barack Obama. But I justified that because he was half white. So I think that's about my limit for explaining white supremacy this morning. So let me segue into my journey out and a couple of really key moments for me. I left the Mormon church in 2018 and all of that collapsed, but I went back right into Christianity and still holding on to the white supremacy, the Christian nationalism, just believing that the Mormon church had been incorrect. I spent 4.5 years in Christianity and still hardcore MAGA. But then I was making lots of new friends, Mexican friends, African-American friends, all kinds of people that just weren't white, and starting to see the world in a very different perspective. And I know that a lot of people have asked me what it was that catapulted me out of white supremacy. Well, first of all, having deconstructed the Book of Mormon and working with cult deprogrammers and deconstruction experts and therapists and just reading books and employing critical thinking for the first time, I then deconstructed the Bible and realized that I no longer see evidence for it or God. And letting go of that and the Garden of Eden and all of the mythology and vengeful God who wants to curse people, that opened up this space for change. So it was my religious deconstruction that led me to begin to deconstruct racism and white supremacy. But it was kind of an accidental little funny thing that happened one day that led to just catapulting me completely out of it. I was just scrolling through Facebook and I came across a professor, and I don't even remember if she was Johns Hopkins or Duke University or where she was, but I found this professor and she was talking about genetics and some genetic research, and she was talking about the gene for blonde hair, blue eyes, and white skin, and how recent that was. I don't even know where to find her now, but it was this whole lecture series on the Fertile Crescent, humans migrating out of the Fertile Crescent and spreading around the world, and then little things like red hair and blonde hair and white skin as we migrated further north. And I had this moment of shock realizing, oh, we didn't